So I want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning to talk about everybody's favorite subject, school funding. I'm Robin Staines. I have the honor of being president of Advance Illinois. We're an independent advocacy organization and policy organization, as many, if not most of you know. And one of the things that we worked really hard on with a broad coalition around the state was to reform the way we fund our public schools. So the evidence-based funding formula was passed. We are going to our fourth year. And it is the right time, particularly when we've got budget challenges and we also have extraordinary student need, to take a look to see how are we doing? Is the formula working the way it was intended to work? Are the dollars going to the districts and the students they're supposed to go to? What impact has that had at the local level? How is this playing out by geography, by race, by income level? What can we learn and what are we learning even in the last 5 years about the impact that sustained dollars have, particularly on districts that have been underfunded in the past? So we have put together a report. We wanted it to be ready in time to help shape and inform the conversation that we're having right now as a state. I think folks are aware that there is a commitment that comes as part of the evidence-based funding formula passage, that the state would put $350 million new dollars into the formula every year for 10 years with the objective of getting us to 90% funded. We were unable to meet that last year. The question then is, are we going to be able to do that? Are we going to live up to that promise this year? And what are the implications if we do? And what are the implications if we don't? And how does COVID impact all of that? We know there are new costs and concerns and issues. We also know there are federal dollars. What's the right way to think about that? So we hope this report is going to be a guide. We are delighted that you're here to join us to talk. We'll talk you through each and every one of those issues. And to do so is the person who, chief author of the report, Melissa Figuera, who's a senior policy associate at Advance Illinois, a senior advisor at Advance Illinois. So I am going to turn it over to the very capable hands of Melissa Figuera, and we will look forward to having time for Q&A at the end. And also we're going to be joined by a panel, folks from the field, Dr. Kamako Patterson and Chuck Lane, superintendents from different parts of the state, different profiles of their community that can talk about the role that ABF has had for them and what they need going forward, and to help put a face on some of the sort of sometimes esoteric conversations about dollars, cents, and formulas. So please, Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Robin. Excellent. So yeah, I think we can dive in. Robin gave us our welcome and introductions, and I just want to do a really quick set of housekeeping with you guys. The one main thing to know is that we will be saving about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for audience questions. You can submit those questions anytime you want throughout the entire webinar or throughout the panel. You can direct them to myself or our two panelists, and please use the Q&A function to do that. We won't be using the chat for questions, just the Q&A. And now let's get into the meat of it. So as Robin mentioned, the Evidence-Based Funding for Student Success Act was passed into law in late 2017. And that means that we now have 4 fiscal years worth of data from the evidence-based formula to look at. We're going to shorthand that as EBF throughout. So that's what that acronym means for you guys. So those 4 fiscal years, FY18, FY19, FY20, and FY21, every single year, the Illinois State Board of Education releases data that the evidence-based formula generates. And with that data, we can start to answer questions like, has the new formula begun to close some of the gaps we know existed across the state, which were kind of the reason that the formula was passed in the first place? We can think about what changes we've seen along different dimensions of equity. So we know that there are a bunch of different ways that you can kind of look and compare at how well or poorly certain student groups are funded. So we can look at that in terms of race, ethnicity, income, English language acquisition, and geography. Those are a few that we focused on in these analysis. Another question that we'd love to answer is, what are the remaining gaps to full funding? We know that some progress has been made, but what work is left to be done in the coming years? And what does that mean for our policymakers and state leaders as they make budget decisions? In our overview of the report contents, that kind of mirrors what I just went through. But as you guys all know, COVID has thrown us a major curveball as a state, as a nation. And that has to be part of this conversation about fully funding education in the state, because it's changed the dynamic. So we also spend some time on that context and those implications in the report. So diving right in, the first question that we kind of set out to answer, just to provide a foundation of knowledge in the report, is, does funding actually matter for student outcomes? And I think a lot of us on the call might think that that's an obvious question, an obvious answer. Of course it matters, but we do sometimes get people who, are doubting or questioning what is the impact of additional dollars or equitable funding on how our kids do. So the first thing we do in the report is that we really firmly ground ourselves in the research. We look at what studies say about this question. And we see that you can kind of take a view that starts at the individual level and zooms all the way out to the macro level to understand this answer. So at the individual level, when we think about individual students, studies are showing that when states increase their investments in education, we see notable gains in academic performance, especially when that money is targeted at the highest need students. And not only do we see improved outcomes on test scores, but we also see gaps shrinking, achievement gaps in subjects like math and reading. We know that our kids are much more than test scores, so we want to look at other kind of outcome metrics to see what the answer to this question is on those counts. And we also see that there are things like increased graduation rates, greater overall attainment, and higher adult earnings that are also associated with equitable and increased investment in K-12 education. Zooming out even further, all of these things aggregate up into an impact on the economy. So we have a solid research base that shows us that economic growth follows this type of investment, as well as increased earning, decreased unemployment, and decreased income inequality. These are all just kind of the positive societal and economic spillover effects. When you put dollars into K-12, you really see these returns down the line. We also want to kind of step outside of the economy into other aspects of the way that we live as a community. And we see that this type of investment does contribute to other positive outcomes. So reduced crime rates and improved health outcomes have also been shown to follow increased investment in K-12 funding. I think it's really important in the context of COVID that we look to what the research says about cuts. Do cuts to education funding have the opposite effect of all these positive outcomes that we see when we increase investment or we invest equitably? And the answer again is yes. There's a recent study out of Northwestern that shows that following the Great Recession, when states cut investment in K-12, we did see a subsequent decline in students' test scores in math and reading. We did see those gaps in test scores by race and income increase. And we also saw a decrease in college-going rates. So there really are some serious negative impacts when we cut K-12 education spending at the state level. And finally, kind of as the title of this slide shows, we do want to make sure that it's clear to everyone that putting money into a system without parameters or without guidance is not necessarily the solution. All of these good things that happen when we invest in K-12 happen when funds are invested in a sustainable, sustained way, and they're spent on evidence-based practices. So that's the research base in terms of why money matters. We also wanted to provide a little bit of context on the evidence-based funding formula in Illinois and what's happened since it passed. So over those first 3 years, the state did put new funding through the formula. Within the formula, they created a commitment to put in at least $350 million year over year. Now that annual amount, which they call the minimum funding level, the reason they have that commitment in there is because that's what you need to invest in evidence-based funding in order to make some forward movement towards fully funding all schools, at least keeping up with cost increases that increase because of inflation. If we really wanted to close the entire gap to full funding, which right now is about $7 billion, we would need to increase more than that $350 million every single year. But at least as a minimum, that's what the state committed to do in order to make some forward motion. The first couple of years of the formula, I'm gonna see if I can use my mouse to show you guys, we did put in about $350 million, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Last year in FY21, because of COVID and the economic impacts, we paused. And for the first year, flat funded the formula, put no new state dollars into it. That is something that's gonna have repercussions down the line because as we mentioned, costs are increasing even at the rate of inflation. And so when we say we're flat funding, what's truly happening is that you're actually kind of regressing or slipping backwards because you're not keeping pace with the kind of increase in the cost of student needs. I'll reiterate that and kind of show some examples later on in the presentation. And do be putting your questions in the Q&A. I know this is going to be a lot of data coming at you really fast. All right, so that is some context setting. Now we get into the meat of kind of the analyses and outcomes that we share in the report. So the first major section is trying to see how well EBF is working to begin to close resource equity gaps that exist for our students and what we have left to do. So the first thing I want you guys to understand before we get into that is how the formula actually works. And I'm hopefully going to be able to illustrate it so that you have a basic understanding of the mechanics and why they drive equity. So the first kind of critical piece to understand about how EBF is designed is that it creates unique targets for every single district in the state that reflect student needs. On the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. The second thing it does is that it actually accounts for local property wealth. We have 852 districts in the state. They vary wildly in terms of the amount of property wealth that they have, and thus the amount that they're able to generate for their schools just from their property taxes. So the formula needs to account for that difference before it's able to drive state funds to schools equitably. Finally, the job of the formula, the real engine for equity that exists within it, is the way that it drives new state funds to districts. And it does this by really targeting the greatest chunk of those dollars to districts that are farthest from full funding. I think this is a lot to take in, and a picture's worth 1,000 words as far as I'm concerned. So the way that we have kind of visualized those things is with this graphic here. So the first part that we talked about was that adequacy-based cost model. So the model asks, how much does it cost to provide a high quality education to all students in all districts in the state? And knowing, like I said, those 852 districts are very different, the model creates a specific target that kind of captures the cost of full funding for all of those districts. That's why those little dotted lines there are at different heights. So what the formula does is it kind of takes research-based practices, things that studies have shown actually have a positive impact on student outcomes, like reduced class size, hiring social workers or counselors, up-to-date materials and textbooks. And all of those things have a cost, right? So it assigns a dollar sign or a cost to each of those elements. And then it also takes into account the fact that some student groups benefit from additional supports. So we know English learners, for example, can achieve at incredibly high rates and even kind of surpass the educational outcomes of their non-English learner peers. But to do so, they really benefit from bilingual coaches or instructional coaches. And that's an added cost for that student group. So the formula takes that into account. So once we have our individual adequacy targets for every single district, the next thing the formula does is figure out how well-funded districts are right now. There's two parts to that. The first is, like we said on the past side, that local capacity target. How much can each district generate from their local property wealth? And you can see here that District 1, for example, is an example of a district that can generate almost everything it needs to fund its schools at a pretty high level, just from its local wealth. And what we see when we look at Illinois is that we do have some very wealthy districts that are able to do this without even having a very high tax rate. On the other hand, District 3 that you see in this example is not able to generate very much at all. That's a representation of kind of some of our more property poor districts, which may be taxing at incredibly high rates and still be unable to generate kind of the nominal dollars they need to fully fund their schools. Because of this inequity in property taxes, that's where the state steps in. Their role is to try to kind of equalize what our students are getting. The way that they've done that in the past has generated kind of a current amount of state funding, and that's the next thing the formula takes into account. So it says, how much can you generate locally as a district? How much do you currently get from the state as a district? And those two things together leave us with our gap to full funding. That's what districts still need in order to reach their adequacy target. And then using that information, EBF drives new state funding in an equitable fashion. So you can see District 3, for example, gets the largest amount of new funding through EBF because it has the largest gap to full funding. One thing I'll note that's pretty important as well is that the formula kind of locks in this base funding minimum. So the state has committed to kind of make that a baseline each year that it funds EBF. So next year, it will at least provide what it provided in the prior year for that base funding minimum in state funds, and it should just be building up on top of it. This is to kind of avoid cuts and shocks to the system like those that have happened in the past. So that's the evidence-based model in a nutshell. And now the question becomes, given that that's how it works, how well is it actually making those changes? Is it actually moving our highest need students up in terms of their percent of adequacy? Is it actually bringing them closer to full funding? So one way we look at that, and I promise this is the most complicated chart we'll show, but I'm going to take you through it piece by piece. One way we look at that is by looking at the concentration of students from low-income households in different districts across the state and how their percent of full funding has changed from before EBF to now. So what we did is we broke the districts in the state into roughly equal groups in terms of student size. So each of these 6 bands includes about 300,000 students. CPS, because it's such a large district, Chicago Public Schools, gets kind of its own analysis called out with its own bar. So what we'll do is we'll first look at our districts that serve the fewest low-income students. Those districts were funded at 124% of full funding on average before EBF. And after the last 3 years of EBF funding, they're at 126% of full funding. These districts actually don't get much at all from the evidence-based formula because they are so overfunded essentially, but they are able to generate more and more from local wealth. So that's what's driving that increase. The next group, these are districts serving between 20 and 33% of low-income students, was at 85% of full funding before EBF, and now they're at 88% of full funding. Our third group, serving even more students from low-income households between 33 and 50%, so this is up to half of your kids from low-income households, was at 71% of full funding before EBF. They're now at 73. And the next 3, I'm going to pop up all at the same time. These are our school districts that have over half of their students from low-income households. Green is our districts that serve the most students from low-income households. And then we have CPS, which is about 75% low-income. You can see from the slope that EBF really is working to drive new state dollars where they're needed most. We can also see it from that number change. Go from 59% of adequacy in our least well-funded districts before EBF to 67% after 3 years worth of full funding. So this is a pretty good way to gauge the answer to that first question. Is EBF driving dollars where they're needed most? And it seems like the answer is yes. Another way to look at it is to kind of take a visual picture of change in percent of full funding over time by looking at our districts. And what we can see here is that the dark red is our most underfunded districts. And between FY18 and FY21, we've seen this chart lighten quite a bit. What I do want to point out is that we still have the majority of kind of our students in districts below 70% of full funding. So the fact that we still have so much orange on this chart means that we have a long way to go. Another way to look at it is by looking at the number of students that have gone from below 60% of full funding, so our most underfunded districts, to above in this 3 or 4 year span of time. And what we see is pretty incredible when we look at it from a student perspective, because in 2016-17, the school year before EBF came into play, there were over 350,000 students in that adequacy band, under 60% of what they needed. Now, after 3 years of EBF, there are fewer than 10,000 students in that band. And you can see from the way this chart works that really what's been done is that those students have been pushed into the 60 to 70% band. So all of this is kind of adding to the proof that we have that the formula is working effectively. The next thing we're going to do is say what gaps still remain in terms of how well-funded our students are. What work is left to be done by the formula since we've only barely just begun. And before we do that, I want to give you a quick overview of the state's demographics, so you have an idea of what the state looks like, what our students look like before we talk about some equity gaps. So first off, we serve about half of our students coming from low-income households and half of our students not from low-income households. When it comes to race ethnicity, we have about 17% of our students are Black, 26% are Latinx, 48% are white, and then 5% are Asian, 4% are 2 or more races. They don't show up here because it's a tiny percent, but it's important to know that about 1% are Pacific Islanders or Native American students. Our analyses focus on the 3 largest student groups, but in the future, we may do analyses that take a deeper dive into the smaller kind of subcategories, because those kids are still making up quite a substantive part of our population. The third dimension that we look at is English learner status. So we have about 12.5% of our population that are English learners, 87.5% who aren't. And finally, we know that Illinois is a very diverse state in many ways. One of those ways is that we have a lot of cities and kind of concentrated urban centers. We also have large swaths of kind of much more rural school districts, and we want to see what's happening between those. So 28% of our kids are located in cities, 20% are located in rural districts or towns, and 52% are in suburbs. All right, so the first resource gap we looked at was our low-income students compared to our students who are not from low-income households. And what we see when we look at this, at the top of these bars is their adequacy target, what they're shooting for. The orange represents their current resources from state and local sources in FY21. So what we see here very kind of starkly displayed is that the gap to full funding for our students from low-income households is about twice the gap for our students who are not from low-income households. And $4,000 per pupil adds up really, really quick when you're a district. You can just imagine if you have 2,000 students, each with a $4,100 gap, you really are facing quite a large hole. And that means you can't hire teachers or counselors or provide the materials that your students need. So this implies that we have a very long way to go as a state, even though we've made some progress in the first 3 years of EBS. The next thing I'm going to show you guys is there are implications of these equity, of these income dynamics for our students by race ethnicity as well. What this chart shows us is the concentration of students in these 3 race ethnicity categories by those that are in districts with less than half of their students from low-income households and those with greater than 50% of their students from low-income households. So these are essentially low poverty districts, and these are high poverty districts. What we see is that our Black and Latino students are by and large concentrated in the districts that are serving the most low-income students. And we know from that last chart that the districts with the most low-income students are also the most underfunded. They're the furthest from their adequacy targets. So this kind of systemic inequity that largely stems from housing segregation is driving a lot of inequity for our Black and Latino students when it comes to school funding. And you can see that when we look at their resource equity gaps through EBS. So our Black students are facing a gap to full funding of over $4,400. Our Latino students are facing a gap of $4,100, and our white students are facing a gap of over $2,000. So this is how those kind of systemic inequities are playing out within school funding in K-12. I have 2 more of these, and then we have a couple more slides on the kind of COVID implications, and then we'll kick it to our panel. Bear with me. So when we look at our English learners, like we said, this is almost 13% of our students, which is quite a large swath. And they, again, have a gap to full funding that's approaching $4,000, whereas non-English learners have a per pupil gap that's about $1,000 less. So we are seeing that we need to do a better job of kind of funding the schools where our English learner students are concentrated. And finally, when we take a step back and kind of look at the geographic lay of the land and these different kind of district locales, we see that cities and rural districts are facing the largest gaps to full funding, with our suburban districts coming in at kind of a smaller nominal gap. And this is really important, I think, because frequently we kind of, in our minds or in conversations, may kind of separate out cities and rural districts. And this is important, I think, to show that both of those, though very different in many ways, both of those types of locales are facing significant gaps to full funding. All right. So I know I went through that a little bit fast, but I think Jose will put a link in the chat at some point. You guys can go check out the report. That'll let you do a deeper dive on all of those statistics, but those are the major kind of findings in the report. The last question that we wanted to ask was, how is COVID interacting with all of this? What does it mean for costs in the state? And I think the most important thing to recognize there is that the evidence-based formula captured costs before before COVID came into play. So prior to the pandemic, the model showed how much it costs to fully educate all our students and provide a high quality education. COVID has now created an entirely new set of costs. There's both the short-term costs of kind of getting students back into schools or continuing to provide remote learning, which comes with its own costs. And those are really and truly significant. One that really struck me was ventilation, for example. So the CDC recommends that buildings have their HVAC systems updated, so their heating, ventilation, and AC systems updated. That can cost up to $1 million just for a single school building. So if you think about that with districts that have multiple school buildings and have to update these systems to keep their kids and educators safe, that bill is going to get very steep very quick. Some of the recent kind of laws and executive orders are going to help defray some of these costs or reimburse some of these costs, but they're not going to be able to get districts all the way there. The other kind of piece of this funding puzzle to think about is that those health and safety costs are already a significant addition to what we need to spend for the sake of our students. But on top of that are the costs of kind of learning renewal or building back better, recovering what was lost in the last year. And those things span academic as well as social, emotional, mental health supports and trauma responsive supports. Each of those things comes with its own price tag. The American Rescue Plan Act and the kind of several $1 billion that that's driving to K-12 education in Illinois is a huge boon to the state and will be really, really helpful in allowing districts to pay for some of these supports. But they'll still have all those costs that created the adequacy gap in EBF to begin with. And some of that is what our two superintendents who are on our panel are going to kind of illustrate for you guys. So I think the last important thing to note, we talked about those kind of federal recovery or stimulus funds, but an important thing to think about is that those are one-time relief funds. So those can be spent through school year 2024. But once those dollars are spent and they run out, districts essentially are going to face a funding cliff. So they're not going to be able to hire permanent staff, for example. If you hire a counselor or a teacher or an instructional coach, and then those dollars run out after 3 years, then you're going to essentially have to either fire that teacher or find another way to make cuts and make up for it. What EBF is intended to do is that if the state continues to fund it, if it puts $350 million in year over year, we should be able to smooth that transition a little bit instead of having districts face that shock. And they went through a similar kind of dynamic with relief funds following the Great Recession. So there's precedent for this. And we can look back at those days and see how important it is for the state to continue to keep its commitment, even when there are federal relief dollars in play. Okay, so our conclusion essentially is that the cost of fully funding EBF is high. $5 to $7 billion to close the gap to full funding is a lot of money. But the cost of failing to adequately and equitably fund the formula is far higher. And 3 quick examples of what we're concerned about if the state does not add dollars to EBF is that we will see widening of those equity gaps that we just showed. So all of those gaps by income, race, ethnicity, English learner status, part of the state that you're in, even with flat funding, as I said before, those gaps will widen because the cost of fully funding schools is increasing at least at the rate of inflation, but it's also increasing because our students' needs are increasing. So if you can imagine that because of COVID and the economic downturn, we have more students from low-income households that are being served by our schools, that increases the cost of educating those students. And so flat funding really means kind of regressing or sliding backwards. The second thing is that if the state doesn't kind of fund the formula and close the gap to adequacy, what's happened in the past is that the burden then falls on local communities to raise property taxes to fill those gaps. In order to avoid that, we would fund the formula. And finally, schools really are economic drivers of our community. About 85 to 90% of district expenditures actually go to salaries. So schools are hiring and employing a large quantity of people in their communities, but also they're educating our kids. And when those kids go on to get their post-secondary degrees or credentials, they in turn contribute to the economy. Every piece of that that doesn't come into play is going to have a negative long-term economic impact on the state. So those are the 3 consequences of not funding the formula kind of based on our research. Okay, so quickly, I will tease that the report tells the story that I just laid out to you guys, kind of draws these conclusions. To accompany the report, we wanted to be able to give people the ability to kind of do a deeper dive or see information about specific districts. So our brilliant policy associate, Helen, has created some interactive equity dashboards. This is going to launch probably in the next week or so. And what you can do on this website once it goes live is you can hover over specific districts in the state or search for them by name and see some information about their demographics and also their change in percent of full funding over time. So how has EBF impacted that specific district? You can go from FY18 all the way to FY21 to see that change over time. And one example of that is just as you see right here. So this is FY18. And we can see that example that we showed before of 350 million students, 350,000 students in districts under 60% of full funding. And then in FY21, about 10,000 students in that band. The other thing you'll be able to do, which I don't have a screenshot of, is that you'll be able to go to your specific district and see how much funding is currently coming from the state, how much funding is coming from local property taxes, what the difference has been in the last 3 years of EBF funding, and what the current gaps of full funding is. So that's going to be a really cool tool, and we're very excited for it to come out next week. It kind of is a nice complement to the report. Okay, that was a lot. I hope you guys are putting questions in the Q&A function. I am going to kick it now to our Director of Community Engagement, Jess Ramos, who is going to facilitate a panel for us with our 2 district leaders, Dr. Kamako Patterson and Chuck Lane. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Melissa. So Dr. Patterson and Chuck, feel free to turn on your videos and come on in. Thank you both for joining us today. I'm super grateful to be in community with you and grateful for this opportunity to dig into the findings of the report, dig into some of what you're seeing in your districts and what's ahead. So I want to just start off by, tell us a little bit about yourself and your district, and I'll stop talking.
So you want me to start first, Jessica?
Sure.
Yes, okay. I'm Dr. Kamako Patterson. I'm the superintendent for Prairie Hills Elementary School District 144. We're located in Markham, Illinois, the South Cook region. We service 4 communities, Markham, Hazelcrest, portions of Country Club Hills, and portions of Oak Forest. We have about 3,000 students, 85% African-American, 11% Hispanic, and about 2% Caucasian. 95% low income. We have 8 schools. It's a pre-K 8 district. I have been in the district for 18 years, and this is my 10th year as a superintendent. Do you want me to continue with our adequacy rate? It's at 58%, or you want me to wait, Jessica?
Go for it. Go for it. And Chuck, you can feel free to share some of that too.
Okay, so currently we have a 12% mobility, and our adequacy rate is we're at 58%. And so I know we're going to have some further discussion, which I'm looking forward to talk a little bit about what we've actually done with the monies and what is needed. And of course, the influx of federal dollars that we're getting related to COVID, which are of course 2 clear, distinct buckets of money. So
absolutely, and we'll keep saying that. Thank you.
Yes.
Chuck, tell us about yourself.
Sure. First, thanks for having me. Always good to work with the Advanced Illinois folks. Chuck Lane, superintendent at Troy High School, located in Southern Illinois, a rural area, about 4 hours straight south down I-57 from Chicago. Around 900 students. We're a 9-12 district with 11 feeder schools, many of which are very small. 62% low income, about 20% minority. A lot of transient people going back and forth between communities here. Mobility rates high. And this is my 14th year as superintendent at CHS.
Awesome. So clearly you both bring a lot of knowledge and institutional knowledge really about the space and your experience as a superintendent. So I want to dig into the findings in the report and bring it back to what you all are seeing in your districts. So the report analysis shows that in general, EBF is working. when it's funded, state resources that flow through the formula are going to the districts that actually need it the most. And we'd love to know, how has your district's funding level changed as a result of EBF, so what Dr. Patterson started mentioning, and what has that change looked like for your schools and classrooms?
So for Prairie Hills, we were, our monies were at 14 million state. The monies that we were initially getting from the state of Illinois was 14 million annually. It is now 19,500,000. So roughly we're seeing an additional $5 million with EBF funding. So it has allowed us to maintain a smaller classroom size, but more importantly, we've been able to hire math interventionists. We've been able to hire instructional coaches. We've been able to just provide more resources related to after school, more resources related to one-on-one tutoring, something that we're going to focus more on because, of course, we're preparing for next year. But without those funds, we would not be able to do that. And we also are having an issue, as you can imagine, with some of our capital, with just our capital projects. So there are issues with our buildings. Our buildings are significantly older, and we are not in the position to be able to adequately take care of those needs. Well, let me say this, prior to the EBF increase, we were not in a position to adequately take care of those needs. We are in a better position to be able to at least address the buildings and to ensure that they don't go into continual disrepair or decay. That's been an assistance, but in terms of real assistance with students, it's been a huge benefit. The additional dollars have been a huge benefit, and we've been very protective of those dollars, and we've been very specific about what we do for students. That matters for us, and we believe in being good stewards of our monies.
Thanks, Dr. Patterson. Chuck?
Yeah, well, before EBF, we were funded at about 52% of our accuracy level, our accuracy target. In FY18, it was about 54%. Then we went to 58% in FY19, and then 62% was our high level mark. Now, with flat funding this year, I'm sure our accuracy target's probably dipped below or around 60%. So the new funding did allow us to pay off a $1 million line of credit that we had to take out during the proration years. We just had to do that just to survive. So the first couple of years of the new funding was basically just maintaining and trying to pay that money back. And we started to catch up on some things. I would say starting probably around FY19, we were able to do some curriculum enhancements and invest some dollars into new technology as our fund balances began to increase. So basically we were in survival mode for a long time during proration. We were proud of the fact that we didn't have to cut any programs or cut any staff, but it was because of that $1 million line of credit that we were able to survive. So, it's funny because legislators would ask us, what were we doing with all of our new money those first 2 years? And my answer was just paying back the bank for the money we had to borrow that we didn't get from the state. So we were just starting to dig out of those holes whenever now we're starting to get flat funded. So we've kind of hit a wall now.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. That's hard to hear, but I know it's a story that I've heard more than once before. Right. I am curious to know, as you were thinking about what you were going to start doing with the new funds after, paying that money back, what are some ways that you've been able to advance equity and access for your students, or that you were thinking about doing before it was flat funded this year?
Sure. What it's allowed us to do really is the things other districts that are better funded get to do all the time. We tried to replace retiring teachers, which we haven't been able to do for a long time. We used to have to just take that money and use it as savings to keep things running. We've been able to not cut things again. Recently, a really good story was we got to hire a veteran English teacher, which, to most districts, well, yeah, why would you just hire the best candidate? Well, for years, if we could replace a teacher, if we could find a teacher, which is a whole nother webinar, we were able to hire not just the cheapest teacher, but a veteran teacher that was the best candidate. And it cost us probably an extra $35,000, $40,000, but that was a success for us. Our board actually celebrated that fact that we're in a position now that we can hire the best candidate. We don't have to not replace the person or just take the brand new teacher that has no experience because of financial reasons. So those are the things that we have been able to start doing. And again, I know in most districts, that seems like that's, there's things you do all the time. But in our area, it wasn't what we were doing. So that has been a success for us.
Yeah, that's incredible. And it's really important to make sure that we're making those connections, right? Between getting more funding for schools means that we're able to address some of these access issues with like bringing excellent teachers to the classroom
Sure.
for teachers, for students, right? Because that makes an incredible difference.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. Yeah. And Dr. Patterson, I'm curious to know, I know you mentioned that you've been able to add some math interventionists and some additional supports for students. How has the additional money allowed you to begin to advance equity and access for the students in your district?
So here's what I'm going to say, Jessica. I think sometimes people, I think sometimes people make the assumption that because you service a population that's low income, it means that they are not entitled to the best. And of course, we disagree with that. So my entire tenure in this district has been based upon providing the very best. So we've not cut the arts. We have, a fine arts, a really good fine arts program that we're attempting to expand. Every student has a device. So I think for us, it is just making sure that what districts who are able to fund themselves, and don't have to worry about state resources, the things that those students are able to have access to are the same things that we are attempting to provide for our students. Just because I have a district that has 95% low income doesn't mean that my students deserve or should have less. And so we make sure that they have more. So I know my colleague Chuck mentioned teachers. We've had issues getting quality teachers in our district for years. This is not anything new. And part of it has been because, unfortunately, we cannot compete with some of the salary scales of some of our districts that have just a little more funding. So the fact that we were able and are able now to hire interventionists and to hire, so, we're hiring interventionists, we're hiring instructional tutors. That for us is huge, because not only are we now able to at least attract, we just negotiated a contract last year. So we're attempting to attract a better quality teacher and a more seasoned veteran teacher, because of course they're going to bring knowledge. Now, we do like our new teachers. We enjoy new teachers, but at the end of the day, we want our students to dominate. We're training them to be productive citizens, but not just productive citizens who go into society to interact. We want them to dominate globally. And so in order to do that, then they need an excellent advantage to an excellent education. And that is what we're seeking to do.
Yes, absolutely. I get that. And the reality is that when you're funding your schools, you're making those investments into the future, right? It's not something that pays off for one student in 1 year. It's outcomes, right? In the future of our economy, our society, and everything that comes after that. And I think that it's important that we center equity and access in that conversation always. So I appreciate that. I have so many questions that come to mind for me as I'm having this conversation with you all, but I also want to make sure that I'm sticking to time.
Okay.
So I have one more question, and then we might do some closing and Q&A. So one of the things that the report considers is the notion that federal funds shouldn't be viewed as a substitute for the state funding that's coming through EDF.
Absolutely.
So I'd love for both of you to speak a little bit more to the role that federal relief funds, such as the funds provided through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act, will be used in your district, and why the state dollars that we're advocating for, on the advocacy side, are also needed in funding your schools and your districts.
So I am going to absolutely answer that question, but I wanted to say one more thing, Jessica, related to equity. And when we start talking about EBF, we receive roughly about $40,000 from the state for our bilingual program, but we spend $200,000 of district dollars just to make sure that our Latino population has what's best and that we have enough staff to address the need. And so I just I did mention that earlier, but wanted to make sure I bring that into the forefront, because with the flat funding, we're now seeing that we're going to have some issues maintaining fund balances and maintaining the quality of programs. The federal dollars are wonderful. I think every superintendent in the state is excited, but it is a one-time, specific, distinct bucket of money. Everyone is attempting to figure out what to do with their monies. For Prairie Hills, we're going to utilize our monies for air quality, spacing issues. It costs $1 million to ventilate and to air condition our buildings. And so we are in the process of we had a project done this summer. We're in the process of having another project done. And so we're looking to utilize those federal dollars for that. We've used the ESSER's monies, the first round, we use all for PPE. That has been extremely expensive. In addition to that, when you start talking about the fact that we're going to extend summer school, which is what we're doing this summer, because we're mandating it, we're going to have to offer transportation to the tune of $275,000. We're also going to extend our after-school program next year. We're doing one-on-one tutoring, mandatory, which also is going to add to the transportation cost. Those are the monies that we're going to utilize with the federal dollars. That's completely separate from the EBF monies, because those are the monies that we need to function on a consistent day-to-day basis. And so I just need, we always need to be careful that we don't, that we don't take the money and put it into one pile. So we're trying to convince and to inform our legislators that that is one-time money. And so we're not attempting to put ourselves in a position where we would have to sustain those monies, because it's just unrealistic when you look at the amount of monies that we're receiving.
Mm-hmm.
So we
Absolutely.
just need to be very clear that these monies are for specific tasks. So if we're going to ventilate a building, that's one specific task. We'll utilize those dollars, some of those dollars for that task. But that has nothing to do with the sustenance that's going to be necessary for my interventionists, for my tutorial programs for our students, for our one-on-one tutoring. We're going to need to sustain that. And those EBF dollars allow us to sustain those programs for our students. The COVID, we will not see the impact of COVID for an extended period of time. So some of our students have thrived, but quite honestly, the majority of my students have not. We've been in person since August. And so we're looking to bring the majority of our students back, if not all, next year. But the reality is that we are going to need our monies to assist our students to try our very best to close the gap that has widened during this past year while students have been on remote learning.
Thanks, Dr. Pedersen. Chuck, I'm curious to know what it looks like for you in Centralia.
Yeah, well, first, it's not like we don't appreciate the amount of federal dollars, flowing to our schools. It's just that we know that's not sustainable. For example, they want us to spend the money on learning recovery or credit recovery, catching kids up, which is a reasonable ask and something we need to do anyway. So we want to do that. So let's say I hire 2 new teachers, assuming I could find them, that do nothing but work on catching kids up and learning recovery stuff. If I use my federal money to pay for that, if nothing new is spent to EBF and we're flat funded, then how do I pay for those 2 new employees when the federal money dries up? Remember, I'm only at about 60% of accuracy and I don't have much money in reserve. So the reality is I can't keep those 2 new employees. Plus, when you consider about 75% of our budget is spent on salaries and benefits, and the federal money really can't be used in those areas unless I hire new people, which I can't sustain later. How am I going to cover my expenses if no new state money flows into EBF? And the sad reality is I can't. So that's kind of where we are.
Thanks, Chuck. And I think what's coming out of this for me is that the reality is that we're still living through a pandemic, right? The pandemic hasn't ended, and we're not just like on, let's start figuring out what happens next. Like, we're still getting through it, and those federal funds need to be used for what's happening now and
Right.
what will happen after, right? How we respond to the time that we see and how these gaps are widening. And I know that there's been, lower enrollment, and especially at the kindergarten level, so like responding to those needs as well is going to be really important, and re-engaging some students is definitely something that we've been hearing. I want to bring Melissa in just because I want to make sure that the last question that I have is something that all of you answer. So I'm going to bring Melissa back. And I'm not done with you all, so don't go away. And I'll start with some questions that the audience has asked Melissa too. So Melissa and Dr. Pedersen and Chuck, feel free to jump in too. The first question that I have is, has funding for special education been affected negatively in any ways under EBF? And what data do you have that breaks out special ed students as a category? And I'll pause there and see if you have an answer to that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there are actually rules in terms of, how districts have to spend their monies for certain student categories, including special ed students. So there should not have been any negative impacts in terms of EBF and the way that those students are funding. I'm seeing Dr. Patterson nodding, and that's making me feel good. And the other thing is that there's actually a professional review panel that was created by the EBF law that's charged with kind of continually evaluating the formula and progress made under it. One of the subcommittees of that group is looking at special education funding and just making sure that those students are getting, equitable funds under the formula as well. Dr. Patterson, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say the same exact thing. Yeah, we have been able to maintain the funding, but of course the fear, of course, is should something happen in the future, or if the funding remains flat, and if, Lord, heaven forbid, we go back to proration, our special education population could possibly be impacted. Yeah, so that's absolutely true.
And Chuck, did you want to add anything? I'm seeing a lot of nods.
Just the same thing. We have a maintenance of effort that we have to do for special ed students. Certainly, when we make improvements to our school, it also includes the special ed students with technology and those kinds of things. So, same thing here.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned proration, Dr. Patterson. We got a question about that from the audience. The question is, what is the impact of proration on the remaining mandated categoricals funding with respect to race equity? Should we advocate both for full funding EBF and also full funding on the additional ed line items?
Yep, the issue for us with proration, to be quite honest, is we're never seeing all of our dollars captured in 1 year. So for those of you that are listening, and let's just use it as a consumer, imagine paying your mortgage and only paying a portion of your mortgage for April and carrying the other portion over into May and continuing to carry. And that is what's happening to us as it relates to the categoricals. We don't see that money by the end of that fiscal year. It carries into next year. And so it absolutely does create a little havoc as it relates to bookkeeping and just making sure that we're keeping up with cost, keeping up with true cost. And no offense, but this is how it starts. So it begins just like this. You don't get all of your money in 1 year. And when you look up, the flat funding has turned into proration. And then you're attempting to figure out how you're going to get your bills paid between July 1st and June 30th, because those are our fiscal years. And that is what creates difficulty. And that is why colleagues such as Chuck have to begin borrowing. For us, we have actually extended beyond our debt limitations, building a new facility for our junior high students, but that's what is unfortunate. And so the state still has not gotten that aspect of EBF correctly.
Yeah, I'll say quickly that, proration was how we got here in the first place. That's why we worked so hard to get the EBF passed. Proration was an issue because if you're heavily relying on state aid, which most of our districts down here are, and so is Dr. Patterson's, when they say we're going to prorate, you got 75% of funding, well, that affects me a lot more than it does wealthier districts. If they only get 10% of funding from the state, they don't even care if they don't get that money. Where down here in other areas, we really are relying on it. So it just wasn't a fair way to fund schools. At the time, Governor Quinn called it shared sacrifice. I'll never forget that. I want to say, wait a minute, how's that shared sacrifice whenever I'm losing 75% of my funding and you're losing 10%? So now with the EBF, it's really inverted to where those schools that are the first wave of inadequacy get the money first. That was a key component that we got added into that, to where if we do get prorated, we will at least start to see those first dollars ahead of other districts that are more well funded.
Yeah, we really have to make sure that we're keeping equity at the center, because if we don't fund the formula, it's going to impact different districts across the state and students, right, in different ways. So I totally get that. Melissa, do we have any more questions we want to get from the audience before our last closing question?
I think we can probably.
There was something on the achievement gap. Melissa, I saw something on the achievement gap, and the answer to that is absolutely. The achievement gap data is garnered from the state assessments. That is how that is what they look at in terms of data to assess what the achievement gap looks like amongst our students in the state of Illinois in reading and in math. I just wanted to make sure I reiterated that.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Patterson. We had a lot of great questions. For the sake of time, unfortunately, we can't get to too many more of them. I'm hoping your closing question will allow us to kind of, back clean up and answer a couple of them. I do want to say a couple people asked if the presentation will be available afterwards, and I think we can share it out. We're recording, so as long as there are no technical difficulties, we should be able to share that as well. And you can always follow up with questions in email if you have burning questions. I'll put my email up on the screen afterwards. So sorry if we were not able to get to your question. Yeah, I'll kick it back to you, Jess.
Awesome. So I have one last question, and we have about maybe three and a half minutes left. So my question to the three of you is, what's one thing you want to make sure that state leaders understand or walk away with when it comes to funding EBF? And whoever wants to jump in and start. No pressure.
Okay, I'll go ahead and go real quickly. First off, just thank you for what you've done in the past and continue to do to help fund EBF and help our schools. I know how hard it was to get the thing passed. So we do appreciate all the things our legislators do for us. But just remember how important funding EBF is to Tier 1 schools especially. When you push new dollars through EBF, you give us much more than just money. You give us hope that our school district can have a bright future, that we can start adding staff and programs that other schools take for granted. Tier 1 districts can't do that unless you push money through EBF. So please don't be fooled by the new federal dollars. Yes, it's nice to have that money coming in, but Tier 1 schools would much rather have steady increases in EBF than large increases in short-term federal funding. Thank you.
I too would like to say thank you to our legislators for the EBF funding formula. I think it was fantastic, but I want to say this: there is never going to be an eradication of the achievement gap if we don't eradicate the inequities that exist. We started behind the 8 ball, so we have only received roughly 2 to 3 years of funding, and that hasn't even leveled the playing field. COVID has now pushed us further back than where we were, and the momentum we initially were gaining as it relates to our funding has now slowed. And so just please keep this in mind. In order for there to be equity, monies need to be put in place so that those students that are disadvantaged have the opportunity. It's an opportunity gap as well. That's not going away unless the funding is consistent, and it needs to be consistent until we can catch up. Because every year that we get additional funding, all we're doing is fighting just to regain ground that's been lost. So we're nowhere near the finish line, and we're nowhere near to being equal with our counterparts. Please keep that in mind. It impacts all of us. At the end of the day, all of us are impacted in our society when we have students that are disadvantaged and unable to compete with their peers.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson and Chuck. And this is why I will always say that we need to make sure that we're elevating those stories from the ground, right? What you're experiencing and what you're seeing, what your students are experiencing, your families, and making sure that our decision makers listen to that, right? And they hear that, because it's one thing to share data and numbers. It's another thing to put stories to that, right? And people to that as well. So thank you both for joining. I'm going to kick it to Melissa for her final message and to close us off today.
Thanks so much, Jess. Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Chuck and Dr. Patterson shared. I really appreciate you guys bringing the district's perspective. I think one thing that's really important to me for legislators and state leaders to kind of recognize is just look at the data, like look at the information. We have qualitative data. We have the stories of students and educators, like the 2 leaders who are on today. We also have the quantitative data. The report shows the hard numbers of what gaps still exist and the work that we have left to do. I also do want to say the work is not done, even if we fully fund EBF. There's intra-district inequities. We had a great question from Ushma Shah at U46. Thanks, Ushma, about how do we then tackle making sure between our schools we are providing students with the resources they need and closing those equity gaps. That information is now available on the school report card. We can start making steps in that direction. But I think really as leaders, it's something that they really can step up and do to find and seek out this information, talk to state leaders like the two who are on today, and also just leverage the data. I think it does really speak for itself. And what it says at the end of the day is that we really need that 350 million in FY22 and in every year coming forward so that we can get back on track to fully funding our schools. We are 1 minute over, so I'm going to kick it to Robin to say a quick thank you, but thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you, Jess, for moderating.
Of course, thank you both.
Thanks so much, Kamako, Chuck. Really appreciate your taking the time. Appreciate all of you who logged in. Please take a look at it. Please spread the word. Talk to others who are interested in knowing what impact we've had so far, what the work looks like going ahead, including your legislators. Take care. Thanks so much for joining us, and onward we go. Best. Bye.